I'm going to start. Yes, I record this, so people can watch it later and listen to me faff and wave my arms because I'm pretty good at that. So anyway, again, we have Alan talking native development, which I'm excited for. I'll let him get set up, and I'm going to get some pizza myself. So, give me a moment. Just have a hard time connecting. Turn the volume. I don't want volume. Gallery. Structure. The meeting. Structure. Share that. Yeah. Should pop up. Cool. All right. Oh. So yeah, I'm out there and I've been doing React development for probably 5 years. And I just built a React Native app, deployed it to the both the Android and iOS app stores. I did that, was successful. Got that deployed about 3 months ago. Done some updates since then, but yeah, this is basically what React Native is React for iOS and Android with a little bit of, there's some differences, but if you have a good solid React foundation, you should be able to pick up React Native pretty easily. All right, cool. So what is React Native? As I said, it brings React.js framework to iOS and Android. The components, because the smartphone doesn't understand HTML, the tags are a little bit different. So instead of using a div tag, you're going to use a React Native component. And we'll get into some code samples. And one of the big benefits to React Native is fast development. So my experience is if you're going to do React Native development, you should have a Mac because for one, to my knowledge, you can't run an iOS simulator on any other, it's only on Mac OS. Now, you can do Android development and run the Android simulator on Windows, but I find it to be clunky. I really recommend a Mac, and I think probably most of you guys have Macs. So under the hood, how does React Native work versus, say, if you were to build, first of all, has anyone done any smartphone development here, like native?
A tiny bit, but it was years ago.
Yeah, right. So I've never done native either. Like I know that with iOS, they use either Swift or Objective-C, and with Android, it's Kotlin, which I've never used, or Java. So it's completely different languages. But if React Native's not native to the device, what it does is there's this thing called this is kind of high level, but it has a JavaScript core engine that interprets the JavaScript or the React Native code, and then it runs it on the device, the Android or iOS device. So with iOS, it's a little faster apparently, because it has a built-in JavaScript core engine. With Android, it has to bundle that in with your code, so it's a little slower. So this is kind of like a high-level view of what's going on here. So this is like your native thread, which always runs on any smartphone device. It's going to, regardless if your app's React Native or not. But with React Native, you've got this JavaScript, and so that has to run on your smartphone to interpret all the JavaScript code, the React Native code, and then it communicates that to the native thread through this magical React Native bridge. But ultimately, the JavaScript turns into JSON, and the JSON shipped to the native thread, and then it renders. So that's kind of a simplistic view of things. I think it's important to know that because it's not quite the same as native, but it's, smartphones are pretty fast today. And unless you're trying to code a game or something, you should be okay. So these are some of the differences and similarities between React and React Native. So both are a mix of JavaScript and JSX. Both use Flexbox, although with React you could use the old school CSS positioning or CSS grids or something like that. But with React Native, everything is Flexbox. So if you have a good understanding of Flexbox, that's a big bonus. So React uses HTML, right, and CSS, whereas React Native instead uses mobile UI elements or components that are specific to React Native, and we'll go through some common ones that you'll want to know something about. And React Native doesn't use CSS, right? So there's this style sheet class, and you create a style sheet, and then you pass in the CSS-like properties to style your React Native app. Whereas with React.js, it's just CSS. So you don't import a style sheet. You instead create a style sheet, and we'll have examples of that slides. So these are some common React Native components that you'll want to know. The view tag is very similar to the div tag in HTML. Text is just if you want to render text, you wrap the text tag around it. Style sheet is actually not a component, but it's a class, and you use it to construct style sheets that you'll use in your React Native components. Button does what it says it does. Pretty straightforward. Pressable is a common tag that you use to wrap. You wrap anything you want the user to be able to touch, and then call a function. And we have some examples of that coming next few slides. Alert is just a common alert message you'll receive on an iOS or Android device. And then for large amounts of data, you're going to want to use either scroll view or flat list. So this would be a whole bunch of data, and the user would swipe up or down to render it or see it. Scroll view is the simple non-optimized component, and the flat list, which I would recommend you use, is the optimized view, and I've got some examples of that. So as I mentioned, the view tag is very similar to the div tag. It's the top level tag you're going to have. So like if you have your app tag, your global tag that starts your application, you'll want to start with a view tag, and then you put everything under that. You could nest view tags, which is very common. Okay, so I had some issue over there. Good. Didn't. Cool, let's highlight. All right, so this is an example of the view, text, pressable, and also how to use the style sheet, construct a style sheet. And you'll see some differences between basic CSS and the React Native CSS. So this is just a generic component. I call it my text component. And the top tag is the view tag, right? And I create a style. We create a style, and we've got, in this case, I'm just setting the font size and the font weight. Now, if you look at the font size, you might wonder, it just says 20. that's actually the pixels on the device. It's whereas in CSS you would probably see, I think you'd say 20 px or like 20 rem or 20 em or something like that. In React Native, there's no units. It's just a number and it's just the pixels. So it's a little simpler in that regard. And it's all camel case. When you create these, when you use the style sheet class to create your style sheet object. So this is a very common pattern. You'll see style sheet at the bottom of components in every file. So you get kind of used to that. Instead of importing a CSS file, that's kind of how it works. So I've got my view. We got our view tag at the top, and then here I've got a pressable tag, and this is so now. What am I doing here is I'm passing on press, which is going to be some function that I call when the user taps anything that's wrapped inside this pressable. So in this case, it's text. So, and if you can imagine what's happening here, there's some text on the screen, and every time the user taps it, it's going to increment the count. And we're using our state up here, which is the same as React, so you get all that. This should look very familiar to you. Now, I specifically wanted to include this extra prop. Now, Pressable has tons of optional props you can pass, but I wanted to pass in this Android ripple. And probably are wondering, like, what is that, right? So there are a lot of functions there are a lot of props that only act on either iOS or Android, and they'll be prepended with either iOS or Android. And that's how you know. So in this case, there's no iOS equivalent. You could probably do what this ripple does, which I'll try to describe it. It's when you touch it, it will kind of ripple a little color across the area so that the user knows that they've touched it. To do this in iOS, it requires a different strategy. But anyway, so just that there's lots of iOS and Android specific actions that you can call. So yeah, that's pretty much that. You have any questions on this? Yeah.
Pressable akin to a button? Or
What?
Is pressable, is that like akin to a button?
It is, but it's not, because you can, okay, so the button class, which we're going to get into that, or the button component, you don't have any style. You can't really style a button, and there's a lot of, when you use Pressable, then what you could do is you could put several things in here and then style it and make it look a lot cooler than a button, actually. So I've seen a lot of examples. They don't like to use the button component. They like to use Pressable and then wrap it inside, and then put their data or their components inside Pressable, and then they'll style the hell out of it to make it look really cool. They'll do the shadows and all that stuff. So you have more flexibility with Pressable, and you can make it a button. So it's a de facto button.
Sounds kind of like on click.
Yes, and on click.
Yeah.
Dip on click.
Okay.
Right, so on press would be on click in this case.
You're using the font size. You're giving like a 20 for the amount of pixels of the device. Since we have so many devices, have you used any like libraries to do some sort of conversion for like the pixel density ratio?
I've never seen that. Like it's not that complicated on. Like, what would be the equivalent on the desktop or browser?
I know that like on some font sizes, like type fonts, like they follow a very specific sizing set. Like if we're sizing by pixels, I imagine that pixel densities across the devices would change. But if the unit of say 20 wasn't,
it's always there. Yeah, that's the way it works. Like there's no other units. There's just a single unit. So it's always, that's why you don't have to specify. And there, it would be an error if you tried to specify. There is no units. You don't even put it in quotes either. So it's assuming it's a number. Like here, you got quotes, and of course other browsers. Yeah, it's really just, it just is what it is.
You know, what I can tell you is a pixel in regards to what's rendered is not equivalent to the pixel that you're thinking of when it comes to screen
Yeah, I think
So-
like the devices kind of do that map. for you.
2560.
It's a pixel.
So there's an article, I'll have to find it, but a pixel is not a pixel.
Right.
Yes. That's
And actually a pixel is actually a reference to the moon, but we'll not go there. So 20 pixels is not actually 20 dots on the screen, right? It's still a device relative size. Because in iOS, you can change screen element density. So 20 pixels will be physically bigger on my mom's iPhone as compared to my sister's. So it's still relative in that way.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, so here's a different, we're doing button here. Button is a lot simpler than doing, say, pressable and then wrapping, but it's doing the same exact thing. So you'll see we got an on press prop that we passed, that we saw the on pressable, same thing. And then we've got a title prop and then a color. So it's a simpler way to do it's just button packaged up, or you can do the pressable way and then have more you can customize it. So that's I really don't, I found, I don't think I used, well, look, I'll show you, but I used pressable instead of button because I wanted to make it look a little different. So but anyway, so the other thing to note here is we're using Flex, and I don't think, so justified content is the same in CSS as it is in the React Native style sheet, but I don't believe this is a legal property in CSS. But this is the way you do it in React Native. And there's also a margin vertical. And I don't believe there's a way, I don't think you can just say margin and then 4 numbers or 2 numbers. Like you have to do margin horizontal and margin vertical. So there's some differences between the way the CSS works. Okay, so this is another common component that you're going to want to use. And I talked about it a little earlier. So scroll view is just kind of the simple way to render a lot of text on the screen and allow instead of it getting cut off, it allows the user to, to comment up and down so they can, like reading a news article or something, right? Flat list is the optimized version, and it gives you some more functionality. So the scroll view just renders everything at once, everything in memory. So there's nothing that, so if it's a huge news article, it'll all go into memory. And smartphones, you'll find when you start playing with the simulator and then actually using the device to do your testing, you'll find that you have to optimize this kind of stuff because it will start getting sluggish. And I notice on Android, it's especially sluggish, and it may have something to do with the way Android renders or has the JavaScript thread in Android. iOS seems to be a little quicker, but either way, I recommend the flat list for rendering large data sets, and I have an example of that. And the other thing about the flat list is I'm sure you're familiar with, if you pull down and you want to refresh the data, you can do that with flat list. Whereas with scroll view, I'm not aware of a way to do that. So this is very simple. This is a scroll view. So if you have a large data set that needs to be able to go up and down, then you just wrap inside the scroll view tag. Pretty straightforward. Of course, you would also have your style sheet. I took it out for simplicity, but you'd want to style it as well, of course. highlighting might not work here as well, so sorry. Oh, well. Should all be highlighted. Stupid. Okay, so the flat list is, you can see, I'll go back to the scroll view. You can see that one's pretty simple, right? Flat list, you've got to pass in a structured object with an ID. It just requires that. And then you've got your data. So you have like line items, whereas with scroll view, it was just a large data chunk, right? So with flat list, you're going to have to get a little more creative. So you got your data objects or wherever, and it has to have some sort of structure so that each line item has got an ID field. And then you just pass in your data, your render item, your key extractor. I know it's kind of, why do I have to do this? It's just a format you have to follow. And then if you want to do the on refresh functionality, you just pass in on refresh and then pass it the function. And here I'm just passing this random on refresh function. In my smartphone app that I'm going to demo later, I'm actually doing this, so it'll be a little clearer. Any questions about the flat list?
What is the key extractor?
Yeah, it's just required for some sort of optimization. And so every line item has to have an ID, a unique ID, kind of like key in like list item. You do in React, it's just required for some reason.
It's how it's mapping the data to be unique. Right. As you're scrolling. It didn't say ID, and it said you would say key dash key dot bob, right?
Okay, so whether you know it or not, you've used smartphone apps, you have used some sort of navigation. And all smartphone apps kind of follow a common pattern for navigations in your, and this is a completely separate library that's built. It's a sub-library of React Native, but it's completely separate. So you wouldn't have to necessarily use this. You could do manual navigation, but you'll see that this is something you'll want to leverage because you get a lot of stuff for free. You get animation, and you get a familiar UX experience that most users are familiar with. So these are 3 common React navigation components: stack, drawer, and bottom tabs. And this is kind of what you're dealing with here. And I'm sure you've done something like this. So the stack is really when you're doing the React Native coding, what your focus is on are screens, right? You shouldn't be worrying about like animation, like things like this, where you click at the top, or as you see some animation here. You get all this for free with React navigation. So your goal as a developer is to code these different screens. So in the stack case, it's just simply stacking screens on top of each other and then popping them off. And you can have as many as you want, right? So at the top, you'll notice there's this back button, right? And that pops the screen. That pops that screen back off the memory of the stack, right? So you get all this for free. You get the animation for free. So here we have the drawer, which is another similar pattern. You've probably used this on some apps before. So you've got a menu. You can drag it with your finger, and then you get a menu. In this case, we've just got 2 items, and then the user is able to click on one of those items, and then it shows that screen here. So that's what's happening with a drawer case. And then bottom tabs, you've probably seen something like this before, where you have some icons at the bottom, and then you click them with, tap them, and then it'll show a different screen. So yeah, this is a really cool library. get a lot of stuff for free, get the animation for free, makes the code a lot easier. You don't have to deal with this. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Highly recommend React Navigation. Any questions on this one? Okay, so now how Expo, anyone heard of Expo? All right, cool. All right. So this is not only does it provide you with additional components that you can use on top of React Native components, but it also is an entire framework that allows you to build, submit your smartphone app to both the iOS and Android app stores or Google Play Store. It's free for small projects. What does that mean? It basically means you can build up to, I think, you can have up to like 100 builds a month. Now, when I built my first app and I had no idea what I was doing, I found myself building a lot because it kept breaking and I ran out of, I think, free builds for the month. But once I got that figured out, I haven't had any problems. And unless you're an enterprise and doing lots of builds every day, the free version is perfectly sufficient. And so I highly recommend Expo because it's a very complicated process to submit your code to these app stores. Now, there's still a lot of extra overhead. Like it doesn't do everything for you. You still have to go through the process of signing up. So with iOS, it's $100 a year, I believe, which is probably expensive. And then for Google, it's just $25 one-time fee. And then you have to send. I think you have to send in your driver's license. We want to make sure you're a legit person. So once you get all that set up, Expo allows you to submit straight to the App Store from the command line, and I'll show you an example. First, there are some components that you get with Expo, and there's a lot of them. These are some examples that I'm using in my app. Fonts, you want to change, make your font different than just the generic font, you can use Expo font. Vector icons, if you go to that URL, it's just all those little common icons you see that are popular, just a whole list of them that you might want to use in your app. Expo status bar, so that the top of the screen on every smartphone, you've got your status that says if you're 5G and if you're on Wi-Fi and you've got a email on the phone, that's actually a component that's rendered. So Expo status bar is what will display that. And Expo location is what I'm using to pull the GPS coordinates because my app requires that to display proper information, make the app functional. So you get that with Expo location. And like I said, I'll show the code later. The other really cool thing about Expo is you don't have to have two different configuration files for Apple and then iOS, which is, the big thing about React Native is you've got one code base, right? You don't have to have an iOS and an Android code base. Another thing you want is just one configuration file, right? I mean, we don't want to have multiple. You want to have an Android configuration file, an iOS configuration file. Now, there may be some cases where you're going to have to do that. But this is an example of, this is a trimmed down version of my configuration file, just showing some possible options that you're going to need. So at the top level, this is the name of your application. And then you've got iOS and Android specific options, right? So here, one thing you got to know is Apple uses a completely different icon standard than Android. As it's a different resolution, and you have to create two different icons. So here I'm telling it with the location of my iOS icon. It took me like 8 hours to make because I'm not a Photoshop guy. And then in Android, these are some example things. So I need the location So I have to tell it I need, for some reason, I had to tell it I needed the course location. This is like the GPS coordinates. I had to tell it course location. I had to pass this. I don't know why to get it to work. And then I had to get the find location just to make it work. So what does that mean? So when I load up my app, it's going to say, this app requires, I'm sure you've seen it before, your location. Do you authorize it? And that's what that does. Now, one of the things, like my app I'm using, I display maps. And in order to do that on Android, you have to register you got to get a Google Services API key or it won't show the maps. And it's free. You get every month you get an allotment, like, I don't know, $100 worth for free, and then it starts charging you. So it's fine for, non-enterprise level. Now, if you're doing enterprise and there's millions of hits, it's going to cost you money. But that's what that's for. Now on the iOS, you don't need a Google Services API key to do their maps because they use a different map. They use their own map logic. Apple has their own maps. It doesn't use Google Maps. Now you can override it and use Google Maps, but I don't see a reason for that. So that's, and I'll show you my config file here in a little bit, but that's just kind of an example of a config file there. So finally, this is the Expo Application Services has a command line function or command line interface that allows you to build and submit from the command line. And these are some common commands you'll use. So when it's time to build or you want to publish to Android, you're going to call EAS build-p Android. That will ship your code off to Expo, and it takes, depending on the size of your app, about 10 or so minutes to build. It also depends on if it throws you the queue or not. But in general, once it starts, it's about 10 minutes from beginning to end. iOS, same thing, about 10 minutes. And then once it's built, then you can submit it to the App Store with the ES submit command. But then that still requires you to have, you have to register, as I said, you got to pay the fee, you got to send your ID and all that stuff. But that's what the ES submit command is. You'll just send the file, and then it's up to you to go to either Google or Apple to continue to complete the process. If you're worried about security on your API key, which is important because if a hacker gets a hold of it, in theory, they could run up a bill on your Google key, your API key. There's a little trick that you can send your key to the EAS servers and they encrypt it and all that stuff. And in theory, a hacker can't get at it. Now, is it foolproof? I don't know, but it's good to know it's there.
I'm going to push you on a quick intermission. Our Zoom account got reduced to the free tier, so I have to close this Zoom and start a second one.
Okay.
So I have to kick you out.
Okay.
You stop.
Round two. Okay. Unless you can actually call on here. You can't see it's black.
Okay. You want a different color?
I think when you tap on the screen there, you can use your finger too.
On that screen?
Yeah, when you can tap it, you can use it.
It's advanced. That would be good to know. I definitely need to work on my presentation technology skills.
I don't think you.
I was just playing around with it. Okay, so yeah, now I will just give you a quick, so this is the smartphone app that I built, and which is why I'm up here doing the talk. So I'll just give you a quick rundown of what this thing does. It uses your GPS coordinates. Of course, you have to authorize it, and then it queries a database right. So it queries a MySQL database that has a front-end express web server that allows API calls from the smartphone to my backend server, and based on the location of the GPS coordinates, then it'll return a list of AM and FM stations within a certain radius of where you're located or certain range. I've got some screenshots here, and it demonstrates some of the stuff that I was talking about. So this right here is like the main screen. So it's going to query all this data is queried based. You'll see like miles. That's using does a GPS lookup, calls the database, and that will update based on where you're currently located. This screen here, this is showing the map. So I'm using this map. This is actually called a map view component. So this is iOS, right? Yeah, this is iOS, and this is not using Google Maps. So you don't need to use the Google API key, but on Android, it's going to use Google Maps. So, there's some differences there. Yeah, so yeah, there's a button right there that I implemented. And if you click that, then it goes here, and then this is a drop-down list. This drop-down component is actually a custom third-party component that I found. And this screen, so you like this here, this is a custom third-party, I believe. Forgot what you call these things. Slider, yeah. That's some open source component somebody built. And these are checkboxes, and that's actually, I think Expo provided that little, it's the equivalent of a radio button checkbox. And then at the top, I'm using the React navigation stack, just the stack one. So, that's that arrow that would pop this off the stack, and it would go back to this page. Same with that, pops it off the stack, pops it off the stack. And of course, you get a little animation on that. And I'll demo this in a simulator. So anyway, that's the talk, and I will now show you that this actually is real. I've got to share a different. Got to share the desktop. All right. So I go to like the root component here. You'll see there's a lot of overhead. Actually, let's close it. Oh, so I'm going to run, this is how you run it. You say yarn expo. That's it, right? Now, this laptop, I think, was 19 or 2019, so it's a little slow. I run a Mac Mini at home. Like, I could never do, you'll see how sluggish it is. Like, you need some horsepower to do development here. All right, so I don't know if you can see that. So I run Yarn Expo, and you get all these options, right? So there's a couple ways. This is pretty cool what it does. So you can actually scan it with your phone if you want, and it'll load it right into your smartphone, and you're testing that way. That's awesome. Or you can run it, which I'm going to show you. I can run it inside the simulator. I haven't really used the debugger much, honestly. I just use console log.
Do you have to be linked with that on some kind of app on your phone?
You have to, what is it saying?
No usable data now.
Oh, I need to run it again, probably. Wait. make sure it's fresh. I just ran it.
Oh, it's on a 10.73 network, so it might be internal the network.
Yeah, it's right. You have to be local to your wherever this is connected.
Is your phone on the same Wi-Fi?
No.
Yeah.
That's right. So it may not work, but that's the idea. So you could at least run it and test it on your phone, which is kind of a cool little thing. It's really easy to just scan it. But anyway, I'm going to run it in the simulator. Show you the simulator. And it takes a little while to load. This laptop. In the meantime,
Are you finding that there's a lot of work for React Native around?
what?
Do you find there's a lot of work for React Native? Are there many jobs available?
Oh, any work? Yeah. Well, I was doing an interview for a couple months ago, and I made it like to the third level, but they wanted someone that had done some more enterprise level in React Native. And maybe my interview skills were rusty because I had interviewed in like 5 years, that's the skills of that. But I've gotten some, I opened up my LinkedIn profile just out of curiosity, and there's some opportunities out there, but you're going to have to, prove yourself. It's, maybe build your own app and, how that works, right? I mean, if you're trying to get a new job in any sort of new area, it's a combination of good interview skills, BS skills, and then actual knowledge, right? So, but yeah, there's some stuff out there. Let's see if this works. I hope there's not a firewall because I have to call my backend, my server. Oh, it worked. Cool. All right. Amazing. All right, so here, all right, so I'm running, in this particular simulator, I'm running an iPhone 14. I don't know if you can see that, but you can run any, if you want to test it on, say, the iPhone SE or any different iPhone, you can do that with this simulator. But I'm just using the iPhone 14 for this demonstration. So I'll kind of show you the app like real time. Just trying to describe it, but this is always something there. So here's, there's a button there, I click, and then, I can drag this around. And you notice it makes a back end call as soon as I drag that. I actually added this feature recently. So if you didn't want to use your GPS coordinates on your phone, you could type in, I'll type in, say New York. And this is using my Google API key to use the Google services location service thing, because this is not, this is all Google's data, right? Again, this is another, there's a lot of open source stuff out there like this sort of thing that you don't have to build this stuff. So that's another big benefit of React Native is there's a large community. So I changed it to New York City. And I hit save, and then now these are all stations within like New York City. So, well, wow, I didn't know Scranton was that close to New York. I need to change I'm too far, 117 miles. So let's move that down. And let's only do AM stations. Oops. Okay. Oh, stuff. There's a few bugs in this thing. All right, so this is a flat list. So if you're actually like driving around and your phone was constantly sending GPS coordinates, you could drag it down and then it will refresh. So that's the flat list refresh that I talked about. All right, so that's doing an API call every time I drag it down. Now let's go to like one of these specific. That drop list, that's a open source, which is cool. I don't want to actually change. So let me get into the code a little bit, so you guys can ask me questions about this. I'm assuming that in this demonstration, I'm assuming you have like some React knowledge, like you understand what use effect is. Things like that, state management. So this is the root, the app component. And I talked about like the status bar, right? That's like the little, at the very top. You have to render that, otherwise it won't show it. That's part of the application. Instead of using like Redux, I'm actually using React context. So I've got this wrapper here for my context, and that's just global state. And then I've got my top level view, and then here I'm going to actually start rendering my application. So app screens. So here there's a lot going on. I talked about the React navigation, right? So you see that up here at the top. And then I've got my screens. So just remember, like what you're really coding is a screen in React Native. So think of everything like a screen, and then you'll have a component. So I've got a screens directory specifically for that reason. Right, screens, right? So I've got 5 different screens that I render. And I set them up here, and they're all stack screens, so they just pop on and off. And that's how you get to them is like you see the arrow here. So if I click that, it adds it to the stack. If I want to pop it off the stack, I click that arrow up there. Same with here, pop it off. That's what's going on. You got to pop it again, and then you're back to the parent screen. That's what's going on here. That's why I have this stack.screen, and then my screen and then I tell it my screen components. Any questions there? Can you read it?
Do you, for network like fetching data, do you use like regular React libraries for fetching data?
You back the API calls? Yeah, I'll show you that. I think I'm using Axios.
Oh, cool.
I may just be using fetch. Yeah, no, I'm using Axios right here. So yeah, I've got this, I've got this HTTPS file that does all my backend. And I think I've just got this fetch stations. But yeah, it uses Axios. I've got a couple other API calls. All right, so back to app screen. So yeah, this here, and now let's go to one of the screens. Let's go to the station screen, which is this right here. I'll go to that component. Stations. All right. I guess I can just kind of go through this line by line. Yeah, so here I'm importing some React Native components, right? My style sheet, flat list, pressable. Platform is a component you can use. You see right here, I can do conditional code if it's Android or it's iOS. Now, in theory, you want to try not to fork your code that's specific to Android and iOS because you can imagine the nightmare that ensues. But there's some times where the phone, the Android, just can't do what the iOS can do, and vice versa. So you may want to do something like this. Okay, so I've got like a global styles. That's just my style sheet that I use. Have all my colors set. So I don't actually specify the hex values directly in the source code. Fetch stations, we just talked about that. That's the actual Axios call to get the data. Filter context, that's React. That's React context for global state. So I use some local state, and then I've got some global states. Yeah, a mixture. Like you say, you can use Redux. It's a personal preference. This is just a Lodash import. I'm doing it for sorting purposes. Oh yeah. So if there's an issue, I guess I could pull the plug. Well, I can't because it would break that. But let's say that the back end failed for some reason. I've got an error screen that will show. So like a network error. So that's what this error overlay is. Loading overlay is when it's waiting for the API call to come in. So it's going to show that. This is all on GitHub, so if you guys want to look at this, you're more than welcome. It's kind of, all right, so here we have, this is kind of like the main, this is kind of interesting. So basically, as you're driving down the road, the phone's going to constantly send GPS coordinates to the app. And how it's going to have to know to refresh the data, right? So that's what's going on right here. So there's this magical, where's location? Right, I talked about Expo location. So there's this location.request foreground permissions async. Basically, that's just sending me the GPS coordinates, sending the app the GPS coordinates. And I have to check the status because I got to make sure that the user granted me permission to pull the GPS coordinates. Otherwise, it's going to throw an error message. And then I call this method to actually get the GPS coordinates. So then I've got live location, and then I set it, and I set it, and then I can set it to state, and then it's magically works. And then there's I set the error here. If I can't fetch the stations, this is actually a state variable. This is in context, so that it knows how to render properly. So I can set error for any of my components. Same with loading. All right. Cool. Yeah, and this one here, here's an example of flat list. You can see that it's, the code can get pretty. I've got some styling on the, I pass in flex here because I want to have everything spaced exactly right. That's why I've got this flex, different values here. Yeah, and I've got everything wrapped inside the pressable. So what is that, right? That's each one of these, this right here, these are all in a pressable. So if I click that, then it goes to the designated screen, right? And here's my flat list, which is this whole thing right here is a flat list, right? So yeah, there's my the different props that you pass. It's a little more complicated than what I show you in the slides, but there's lots of different options. But yeah, you want to use flat list because otherwise, if you try, you can't. You see, it's pretty smooth on the scrolling, and then it kind of bounces. It works pretty cool. I could try to run this. I don't. My laptop's just too slow, but I have the Android simulator here also. But you just have to take my word for it. It does work. And what you do here is you hit option. Get that command line. Expo, you'll see. Oops. Clear this. So the one cool thing about Expo is that
10 minutes.
yeah, I'm pretty much done here. So I'll show you this. So when you run the Yarn Expo and you get all these different options, all you have to do is just hit either I, and it just will fire up the iOS simulator, or A, it fires up the Android simulator. I don't know what people did before Expo, and I think Expo's pretty new. I can only imagine what a pain it was.
What did we use before? I it does not come to my mind, but we used to just compile everything to a web page. And so it's like we were still building on JavaScript. It was just like you're using Safari or Chrome as an app. I cannot remember the name of that.
Well, a lot of that, like you asked me about the job,
Okay.
how the job market is. So the interviews, the people that interview me, they have their app just in a web page, like you're talking about. And I guess that, but then you don't get, you can't have an icon, it's not a very user-friendly experience versus, but it does work.
Yeah. It's a lot of responsive web design, all the things they teach at boot camp now, it's still not the same. It's not compared. You also don't get API access to, you can't use Google Maps and file system and all that stuff with a web page. So if you need native APIs, you have to use a map.
Right, so that map view that I would show you guys, that's what there's this component here, map view, and you just pass in some lat long, and then you get you can specify the pin actually, and lots of different options, and it's pretty cool looking without much work. I don't even see now. Yeah, and you notice it says Apple on Maps down in the left corner because I'm running it inside iOS. Oh yeah, so yeah, you got your map view and then my marker. That's right, I forgot this. So the marker is another tag, and that's what the little pin is, right? You pass in the coordinates of the marker, and it's relative to the map view, which displays the whole map. And you can get pretty fancy with this. It's pretty flexible. I think you could even write a game in React Native, but you couldn't write like a shoot 'em up type thing because it's just not fast enough. But you could probably write like a Sudoku or a chess game or something.
So one of the jobs I was interviewing for this last time, they were wanting, instead of React Native, use Flutter. You had
I've heard of that.
See it?
I haven't looked at it, but have you looked into it at all?
Superficially. So Flutter is by Google, and it's not JavaScript, it's Dart. So
Dart.
Different language. So obviously different paradigms. It does deploy, you can build for iOS and everything, but I have never even touched it yet. So I just know right now, according to the charts, it's Expo, React Native, Dart.
Yeah.
So stick with JavaScript, learn a new language.
I mean, yeah, you have to pick. You can't learn everything. And the reason React Native, I know React, so I'm like, okay, I can probably pick this up quickly. Trying to start from total scratch I only got so much capacity in my brain. I'd have to shove something out to that's something. Yeah.
The main difference that what I see community wise is React is you have a lot of dependencies. You want maps, go get maps. You want this, go get that. And as we know with dependencies, they either get outdated or inversely, they're updated way too often and totally screw up your API. Flutter is like they built the entire ecosystem to build your entire app in one library versus having to import a whole bunch of dependencies. That's my knowledge of native development. So, well, I will thank you very much. Yes.
Yeah, one last one. When you submitted for the Apple Developer Program, like how you probably did it through individual, not organization, right?
Yeah.
How quick did that go? What was it? How quick was that process?
I think it was like a couple days. And then when you actually submit the app, it takes like 24 to 48 hours for them to either approve or deny. So yeah, and the Google is about the same on the application process. And then of course, every time you do an update, every time you want to create a new version, you've got to go through the same process. You have to submit it, and then they have to look at it. And it takes like, the first submit, it seemed to be a lot faster, and then my updates, it seemed to be a little quicker. But I think an actual person is going to have to actually looks at it. So I don't know if that answered.
Yeah, that's quick.
That's the tick mark for web development, right? Using a responsive web app, it's just the URL. Apple doesn't control that, right? There's a lot of complaints with the App Store development getting approval. You make one line change, you resubmit, and you wait
About 48 hours, depending. Yeah.
maybe a week, and they could deny it for like, we don't like the language you use here.
Yes, I got mine denied over and over because I didn't write the reason I needed the user's location in exactly the right way.
Mm-hmm. So it's bureaucratic. Yeah. Anyway, I'm going to cut off the recording. Thank you for joining us, Tyson. And we have just probably about 5-10 minutes before I kick you out. Brandon would like to go back home. Yeah, today is a holiday, so he doesn't want to hang out here. He has to. So, all righty. Thank you, everyone.